In this episode, we're going to take the life cycle thinking from the last lesson and make it real by focusing on implementation, meaning how security controls actually get put in place and kept in place as a system moves from idea to retirement. A lot of security trouble comes from good intentions that never fully become consistent practice, especially when projects move fast and ownership changes. The word traceability sounds formal, but the concept is simple. You should be able to follow a security requirement from the reason it exists, to where it is implemented, to how you know it works, and to how it stays working after changes. When traceability is missing, controls become scattered and inconsistent, and the organization starts relying on memory and hope. By the end, you should understand how to implement controls as a continuous thread through the life cycle so that security is not a one-time event, but a maintained quality of the system. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A security control is a safeguard that reduces risk by preventing problems, detecting problems, or limiting damage when problems occur. Controls can be technical, like enforcing access rules, and they can be procedural, like requiring a review before a sensitive change. Beginners sometimes assume controls are mostly products or tools, but a control is really a commitment to a repeatable behavior, whether that behavior is performed by people, systems, or both. Traceability is what keeps that commitment intact as time passes, because it ties each control back to a specific purpose and forward to a specific proof. When the purpose is clear, teams understand why the control matters and are less likely to bypass it. When the proof is clear, teams can verify the control is functioning and can detect when it has drifted or degraded. Traceability, therefore, turns controls from isolated tasks into an organized system of protection that can survive real-world change. To understand traceability at a beginner level, imagine a chain that starts with a risk or requirement and ends with evidence. The requirement might be that only approved roles can access sensitive customer data, because exposure would cause harm. The control might be access rules that enforce role limits and additional verification for privileged actions. The evidence might be a record that access rules exist, that they were tested, and that logs show the rules are being enforced. Traceability means you can point to each link in that chain and explain how it connects, without inventing stories after the fact. Without traceability, the organization might still have access rules, but nobody can confidently explain whether they cover every pathway, whether they were tested, or whether a recent change weakened them. That lack of confidence is itself a risk, because uncertainty makes response slower and decision-making more emotional during incidents. The life cycle begins with planning and design decisions that define what controls are needed and what they must accomplish. At this stage, traceability starts by being specific about security requirements, not as generic statements like "be secure," but as practical expectations tied to what the system will do. If the system will store sensitive information, requirements might include access restrictions, monitoring of sensitive actions, and safe handling of data throughout its flow. If the system is critical to operations, requirements might include resilience and recovery capabilities that limit downtime and preserve integrity. Traceability at this stage also means identifying where in the system those requirements will be satisfied, because a requirement without a planned home often becomes a last-minute scramble. When planning is precise, implementation becomes clearer, because teams know what they are building toward and can avoid arguing about expectations later. This early clarity is one of the biggest predictors of whether security controls will be implemented consistently. As design becomes more detailed, traceability shifts into mapping, which is the act of connecting each requirement to one or more planned controls and to the parts of the system they will affect. Mapping is not about creating paperwork. It is about preventing gaps and overlaps. A gap happens when a requirement has no real control, so risk remains unmanaged. An overlap happens when multiple controls try to solve the same problem in incompatible ways, creating complexity and inconsistency. Good mapping also considers trust boundaries, meaning where the system must verify instead of assume. For example, If the system receives input from users or external partners, the design should include controls that validate that input and enforce authorization consistently. Mapping at design time helps you predict how controls will behave across components, not just within a single component, which is crucial because many real security failures occur at the seams where systems connect and responsibilities are unclear. When the system moves into build and implementation, traceability becomes a daily discipline rather than a one-time plan. The key idea is that controls should be implemented as part of normal development and system configuration, not as special tasks that are easy to postpone. This means teams implement access checks where they belong, handle sensitive data consistently, and ensure that logging exists for actions that matter, like privilege changes and sensitive data access. A beginner misunderstanding is to treat controls as optional enhancements that can be added later, but certain controls must be built in because retrofitting them is expensive and sometimes impossible without redesign. Traceability helps here by making it clear which requirements are being implemented in which parts of the system, so that work can be verified and tracked instead of assumed. It also supports coordination across teams, because different teams can implement different controls while still maintaining a shared understanding of the overall security story. Consistency is one of the hardest parts of implementation, because a control that works in one area but not another creates a false sense of safety. For example, a system might enforce access rules in the main user interface, but fail to enforce the same rules on a background service or an alternate pathway. Another system might log sensitive actions in some components, but not in others, creating blind spots that only appear during an investigation. Traceability helps prevent this because it requires teams to account for all relevant pathways, not just the most obvious one. When a requirement says sensitive actions must be logged, traceability forces the question of what counts as a sensitive action, where those actions occur, and how the system ensures logs are captured consistently. This is not about distrust of teams. It is about acknowledging complexity and preventing hidden assumptions. The result is a system where controls behave predictably, which is essential for both prevention and response. Testing is where traceability becomes proof rather than intention, because testing checks whether controls actually work under real conditions and misuse. A system can look secure in normal use but fail when someone tries unusual inputs, unexpected sequences, or edge cases. Traceability supports meaningful testing because it gives testers a clear target. Each requirement and control mapping implies specific behaviors that must be verified. If the requirement is least privilege, testing should confirm that users cannot perform actions outside their role and that privileged functions are protected appropriately. If the requirement is monitoring and detection, testing should confirm that important events are logged and that logs contain enough context to support investigation. Testing also checks that controls do not break the system in ways that cause teams to disable them later, because controls that create repeated operational pain tend to be bypassed over time. When traceability includes test evidence, the organization gains confidence that controls are not only present, but effective. Release and deployment are moments where controls can be accidentally weakened, even when implementation and testing were strong. This often happens because environments differ, configurations drift, or teams prioritize uptime and speed under deadline pressure. Traceability is valuable here because it provides a checklist of what must be true in the live environment, not just in development or test. If the system needs certain logging enabled, traceability ensures that logging is confirmed in production and not left behind in a test environment. If access restrictions depend on specific configuration settings, traceability ensures those settings are verified during deployment. This is also where traceability supports accountability, because there should be clear owners who confirm that control-critical configurations are correct. Without traceability, teams may assume the system is secure because it passed testing, while a deployment change quietly disables an important safeguard. With traceability, release becomes a controlled transition into a secure operational state rather than a leap of faith. Once a system is running, traceability becomes the backbone of maintaining controls over time, because operations is where security posture can drift without anyone noticing. Drift happens when exceptions accumulate, patches are delayed, monitoring rules are adjusted without review, or new integrations are added without fully considering impact. Traceability helps because it allows the organization to regularly confirm that key requirements are still being met, even as the system evolves. For example, if a requirement is that privileged access is tightly controlled, traceability should connect that requirement to operational routines like access reviews and to evidence that reviews are actually happening. If a requirement is that sensitive actions are logged, traceability should connect it to monitoring practices that confirm logs are being produced and retained. This is how security becomes durable. Controls are not only installed, but maintained, checked, and corrected when they weaken. Operations without traceability often become security by habit, and habits are fragile when pressure rises. Change management is one of the most important places to apply traceability because change is how systems grow and how risks shift. Every change can affect controls, even changes that do not sound like security changes, such as a new feature, a new dependency, or a performance optimization. Traceability supports change management by making it easier to identify which requirements and controls could be impacted by a proposed change. If a change affects authentication, it may impact access control and user identity confidence. If a change affects data storage, it may impact data protection and monitoring. If a change adds an integration, it may create new trust boundaries and new exposure. When traceability is strong, teams can quickly see which security checks are relevant, which tests must be repeated, and which operational monitoring must be updated. This reduces disruption because the security impact is evaluated as part of normal change planning instead of being discovered after deployment when it is far more expensive to fix. Another essential part of implementing controls throughout the lifecycle is ensuring that evidence is collected in a way that is useful for both internal improvement and external accountability. Evidence should not be treated as a bureaucratic requirement, but as a practical tool that supports confidence and learning. Evidence can include test results, configuration confirmations, review records, and monitoring outputs that show controls are functioning. Traceability links evidence to requirements so that the organization can answer questions like, how do we know this control exists? How do we know it works? And how do we know it stayed working after changes? Without that linkage, evidence becomes a pile of unrelated artifacts that nobody trusts. With traceability, evidence becomes a story that can be followed and verified, which makes audits less painful and makes incident response faster because teams can quickly understand what protections were supposed to be in place. Evidence is not the goal, but it is the support structure that allows the goal to be trusted. Beginners sometimes assume traceability is only useful for large organizations or highly regulated environments, but it is valuable anywhere you want consistency and fewer surprises. Traceability reduces misunderstandings because it forces clear definitions and clear ownership. It reduces rework because teams catch gaps earlier instead of discovering them late. It reduces conflict because decisions are anchored to agreed requirements instead of personal preferences. It also helps with onboarding and transitions because when people leave or teams reorganize, traceability preserves the security intent of the system so new owners can maintain it without guessing. In real organizations, turnover and shifting priorities are normal, and security that depends on a particular person remembering how things work is fragile. Traceability turns security from personal memory into organizational knowledge. That shift is one of the biggest reasons controls can remain effective over the full life cycle instead of fading as attention moves elsewhere. Retirement is the life cycle stage where traceability prevents a special kind of hidden risk, leftover exposure from systems that are no longer actively managed. When a system is decommissioned, it is easy to focus on turning it off and moving on, but retirement includes security controls that must be completed deliberately. Access should be removed, integrations should be disconnected, and credentials that were used by the system should be revoked so they cannot be misused later. Data should be handled according to the organization's obligations, which might include retention, archiving, or secure deletion. Traceability helps retirement because it shows what data existed, what controls protected it, and what must be done to close those controls safely. It also helps confirm that the system is truly gone, meaning it is no longer reachable and no longer depended on by other systems. Retirement done without traceability often leaves doors cracked open, and attackers are very good at finding cracked doors. A practical way to think about implementing controls with traceability is that you are building a continuous narrative of protection that stays coherent across time. The narrative begins with a clear requirement based on real risk and business impact, continues through design and build where controls are implemented, is proven through testing and release verification, is maintained through operations and change routines, and ends with safe retirement. Each stage has a purpose, and each stage produces information that supports the next stage. If any stage is missing, the narrative breaks, and broken narratives lead to gaps, drift, and confusion during high-pressure moments like incidents. When the narrative is intact, teams can act faster because they are not reinventing decisions, and they are not debating expectations each time. They can also improve steadily because they can see where controls are strong and where they are weakening. Traceability, therefore, becomes a way to keep security execution steady and mature, even when the organization moves quickly. As you bring this lesson together, the main idea is that implementing security controls throughout the lifecycle is not just about installing safeguards once, but about maintaining a connected system of requirements, controls, and evidence that stays accurate over time. Traceability makes that possible because it ties purpose to implementation and ties implementation to proof. Planning and design provide clarity, so controls have a real home and a real objective. Build and testing create consistency and confidence, so controls are not partial or accidental. Release verification ensures the live system matches the intended security posture. Operations and change management keep posture from drifting as the system evolves. Retirement closes exposure so old systems do not become forgotten risk. When you can follow the chain from requirement to control to evidence across the lifecycle, security becomes not only stronger, but also calmer and more predictable, which is exactly what organizations need if they want security to scale without constant disruption.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.